Battle of Barnet, 1471 AD. How Edward IV outsmarted Warwick the Kingmaker in the fog of war. Imagine this, a king once made by the very man who would now bring him down. But how did a friendship so powerful, so crucial to the throne of England, unravel into betrayal, battle, and bloodshed? Why did Edward IV, the king who had everything to thank Warwick for, suddenly find himself plotting against the very man who had put him on the throne? And what role did the enchanting Elizabeth Woodville play in tearing apart this legendary alliance? Welcome to the Battle of Barnet, a battle fought not just with swords and soldiers, but with secrets, betrayal, and the ever-present fog of confusion. Picture this. Edward IV, fresh from exile, returning to reclaim his throne, marching his men into the dense morning mist on Easter Sunday. But did you know that Warwick, the Kingmaker, was already certain of his victory, until a single mistake sent his army spiraling into chaos? In this thrilling recount of history's most dramatic duel of wits and wills, we'll unravel the mystery behind one of the most infamous betrayals in England's bloody Wars of the Roses. What were Edward's plans? How did Warwick fall? And who really wielded the power in this epic struggle for the throne? Join us as we uncover it all. Stick around to the very end, because the final twist will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about loyalty, kingship, and the cost of ambition. Subscribe now to our channel, where history isn't just told, it's felt. Get ready to dive deep into the drama, the suspense, and the untold stories of the past that continue to shape our world. You won't want to miss it. April 14th, 1471. The dawn breaks, shrouded in a thick fog, as if the very heavens themselves were hiding the outcome of what would unfold that fateful day at Barnet. Edward IV, the restored King of England, stands on one side, a towering, charismatic figure, now tested and hardened by years of treachery and warfare. On the other side is his former ally, now his deadliest enemy, Richard Neville, the Earl of Warwick, the infamous Kingmaker, a man whose ambition rivaled the gods. In his time, Warwick had created kings as easily as one might shuffle cards, and now he intended to unseat Edward for good. The battlefield at Barnet would not just decide who wore the crown of England, but who controlled the kingdom's future. To understand the battle at Barnet, we need to wind the clock back. A lot. This wasn't just a sudden skirmish, after all. No, this was a showdown brewed from years of political betrayals, royal tantrums, and a soap opera-worthy mix of family feuds. It all started in 1461, when Edward, a handsome and dashing young Yorkist, took the throne after the decisive Battle of Towton, the bloodiest battle ever fought on English soil. The Lancastrians, led by the weak and occasionally senile Henry VI, were routed, and Henry fled to Scotland, dragging his formidable wife, Queen Margaret of Anjou, with him. Edward, at just 19, was crowned king. But let's not be too quick to hand him all the credit. No, the brains behind the operation was Warwick. It was Warwick's tactical genius, his deep political connections, and his ability to sniff out an opportunity that had paved Edward's way to the throne. For the first few years of Edward's reign, the real power behind the throne was Warwick. Some even whispered that if you wanted anything done in the kingdom, you didn't go to the king, you went to Warwick. The Earl governed through Edward, wielding power like a puppeteer, pulling the strings of a handsome, though youthful, king. Edward was the public face, but Warwick was the man behind the curtain, making all the important decisions. And Edward? Well, he didn't seem to mind much. He was enjoying life as a king, a bit too much. In 1464, King Edward met a beautiful widow named Elizabeth Woodville. Now, Edward was known for his youthful exuberance, particularly in the romantic department, and this encounter would turn the kingdom upside down. Elizabeth came to him not as a star-struck maiden, but to demand that her late husband's property be returned. Not your typical introduction, but it worked. Edward, captivated by her beauty and her fiery spirit, proposed to her. When she insisted on defending her honor with a knife, Edward was even more impressed. A woman who can wield a blade, she'll make a great queen. And so, in a secret ceremony at her family home, Edward married Elizabeth. Cue the record scratch. This was not in Warwick's plans. Elizabeth Woodville, as lovely as she was the daughter of Sir Richard Woodville, a common knight, and Jacquetta of Luxembourg, who had scandalously married beneath her station after the death of her first husband, the Duke of Bedford. Elizabeth herself was the widow of a Lancastrian knight and had 2 sons from that marriage. For Warwick, who had been busy negotiating a royal match between Edward and a French princess, this was an unforgivable blunder. He was furious. He had gone from orchestrating international alliances to watching his king flaunt a love match with a widow of dubious connections. Warwick was especially humiliated when Edward began to shower Elizabeth's large family with titles, lands, and wealth. It didn't help that Edward paraded his queen's portrait everywhere, most notably at Queen's College, Cambridge, where Elizabeth's likeness was displayed as if to say, "Yes, Warwick, I did marry her, and I'm proud of it." Warwick's frustration with Edward turned into open animosity by the late 1460s. What had started as small disagreements over policies, like Edward's decision to pursue a Burgundian alliance instead of a French one, erupted into a full-blown schism. Warwick had been eyeing a French alliance for years, hoping to cement England's ties with the continent, but Edward, ever the independent spirit, went behind Warwick's back and married his sister, Margaret, to Charles the Bold of Burgundy in 1468. For Warwick, this was the ultimate betrayal. Feeling sidelined and powerless, Warwick hatched a plan to replace Edward with someone more controllable, someone like Edward's younger brother, George, Duke of Clarence. In 1469, Warwick and Clarence began spreading rumors that Edward was illegitimate, planting seeds of doubt about his claim to the throne. Then, in secret, Warwick arranged a marriage between his daughter, Isabel Neville, and Clarence, sealing their alliance. Warwick's rebellion soon erupted into violence. In July 1469, he intercepted Edward's forces at Edgecote Moor, where Edward's army was crushed. Warwick captured the king and had the Queen's father, Sir Richard Woodville, and her brother, executed for good measure. For a brief moment, it seemed like Warwick had won. But Edward, ever the survivor, regained control, forcing Warwick to release him after the country descended into chaos without a functioning government. Edward, ever the optimist, hoped for reconciliation. In 1470, he staged a public reunion with Warwick and Clarence in Parliament, trying to paper over the cracks in their relationship. But the wounds ran too deep. Soon after, Warwick and Clarence were implicated in a rebellion in Lincolnshire. Fearing Edward's wrath, they fled once again to Calais, only to find the gates barred against them. Desperate, Warwick did the unthinkable. He allied himself with his old enemy, Margaret of Anjou, the exiled Lancastrian queen. In a stunning twist, Warwick helped restore Henry VI to the throne. But Edward wasn't done yet. It's April 1471, and England is in turmoil once more. Edward IV, a king in exile, had found himself in the most unusual of positions, backed by foreign powers after his one-time ally, Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, turned against him. Warwick, the notorious kingmaker, had done what no one thought possible, ousted the man he had once placed on the throne, and made Edward's life a living nightmare. Edward had fled to Holland and Flanders in late 1470, licking his wounds, but exile had only sharpened his resolve. By early April of 1471, Edward was ready to return. He sailed across the Channel with a band of loyalists, including his brothers, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, the future Richard III, and George, Duke of Clarence, the ambitious traitor turned reconciled sibling. And what a reunion that was! George, ever the opportunist, had betrayed Edward to side with Warwick, hoping to grab the throne for himself. But blood is thicker than ambition, at least temporarily, and Edward, the master of political theater, engineered a heart-wrenching reconciliation with George. Their mother, Cecily Neville, had worked tirelessly to bring her sons back together, hoping family ties could heal the wounds of betrayal. As for Edward's sisters, they played the court's power games like pros, subtly advocating for their brother's return and spreading whispers that painted Warwick as a traitor. Edward's arrival in England was nothing short of a royal spectacle. Armed with nothing but charm, cunning, and a small but loyal force, he landed on the coast and began a lightning march towards London. The fog of Easter Sunday, thick and almost impenetrable, clung to the English countryside like a veil of uncertainty. It was the perfect cover for a king in need of a little divine intervention. On the morning of April 14th, under the cover of that fog, Edward gathered his troops and prepared for battle. His brothers, Lord Hastings, and his trusted commanders stood beside him, faces grim but determined. His plan was simple: use the fog to mask their approach and catch Warwick off guard. The irony of it all: Warwick, the man who had built and broken kings, was about to be undone by a fog so thick that even the best-laid plans would fall apart. Warwick's army was no joke. He had the numbers, a formidable force, and confidence that Edward would be brought down once and for all. His men were positioned on the rolling hills near Barnet, prepared for what seemed like a sure victory. But fate and a little fog had other plans. As dawn broke over Barnet, the fog hadn't lifted. Visibility was non-existent, and Warwick's battle plan quickly descended into chaos. The Earl of Oxford, one of Warwick's best commanders, led his troops so far to the left that they entirely missed Edward's army. The mist played tricks on everyone. Oxford's men, thinking they were flanking Edward's forces, ended up crashing into Warwick's center. To make matters worse, in the haze of battle, Warwick's forces mistook Oxford's banners for those of Edward, and they began attacking their own men. A mix of panic and confusion swept through Warwick's army as chaos spread. Men screamed orders no one could hear. The sound of steel on steel filled the air, and soldiers hacked at friend and foe alike, unsure of who they were actually fighting. It was in this chaos that Edward struck. Edward IV, who had always been more of a warrior than a politician, rode into the fray with all the fury of a king reclaiming his throne. His sword flashed through the fog as he cut down Warwick's forces one by one. No distant ruler hiding behind a line of soldiers, Edward was in the thick of it, fighting alongside his men like a lion leading the hunt. His soldiers, seeing their king risk his life, rallied around him with a fierce loyalty that Warwick could only dream of. Warwick, realizing the battle was slipping from his grasp, made one last desperate charge. The Kingmaker rode into the heart of the fighting, sword raised, hoping to turn the tide. But it was too late. Edward's forces had momentum, and Warwick's army was disintegrating by the minute. Amidst the fog and confusion, Warwick's horse was struck down, and the once mighty Earl found himself in the mud, his men abandoning him as the day was lost. There would be no last-minute redemption for Warwick. Pulled from the ground and surrounded by Yorkist soldiers, the Kingmaker met a fittingly brutal end. The man who had built and destroyed kings was now himself cast down. Warwick's death wasn't just the end of a battle. It was the end of an era. His ambition, his ability to manipulate the throne from behind the scenes, had led him to this muddy, blood-soaked field. And as if fate couldn't be crueler, Warwick's ally, Queen Margaret's son, Edward of Westminster, was slain in battle. Margaret herself was captured shortly after, her hopes for a Lancastrian restoration shattered alongside her son's body. On May 21, 1471, Edward IV rode back into London in triumph. The people lined the streets, cheering their king's return. His first stop, Westminster Abbey, where his beloved wife Elizabeth Woodville had taken sanctuary with their children during Warwick's rebellion. To Edward's surprise and joy, Elizabeth had given birth to a son in his absence. It was the ultimate vindication, a new heir to the throne, the symbol of his enduring legacy. But the political machinations were not yet over. That very night, in the Tower of London, the deposed King Henry VI, who had been reinstated by Warwick only months earlier, was murdered. Officially, it was reported that Henry died of melancholy in his cell, but few doubted that Edward had ordered the death of the last Lancastrian king. With Henry dead, Edward's grip on the throne was secure, and the Yorkist dynasty seemed unassailable once more. As Edward stood over the battlefield at Barnet, reflecting on the bloodshed and betrayal that had led him here, one can only imagine what went through his mind. Warwick had been his friend, his mentor, his most trusted advisor. Together, they had reshaped the fate of England. But in the end, ambition and distrust had destroyed them both. The Battle of Barnet was not just a clash of armies, but a clash of wills, of egos too large to coexist. The fog of war, both literal and metaphorical, had blinded everyone involved. But Edward IV emerged from it victorious, proving that even the Kingmaker was not immune to the consequences of his own ambition. And thus Edward IV's reign continued, cemented in blood and betrayal. But the scars of Barnet would never truly heal, especially not with George, Duke of Clarence, plotting his next move. After all, in the Game of Thrones, loyalty is fleeting, and ambition is eternal. Coming up next, the Battle of Bosworth Field, 1485 AD, the clash that changed England forever. Imagine it, on a misty battlefield, the last true Plantagenet king, Richard III, fights desperately to hold on to his crown. Opposing him? Henry Tudor, a man whose very existence was once seen as a long-shot gamble. In one fateful charge, the tides of history will turn, and a new dynasty will rise. Curious about how this epic battle ended the Wars of the Roses and shaped England's future? You won't want to miss this. Subscribe now to uncover the secrets, the betrayals, and the bloodshed that forged a new era. Be part of our journey through history. You'll gain insights and stories that you simply won't find anywhere else.